Earlier this year, when I switched over almost all of my lenses from the EF mount to the RF mount, I made an assumption that the RF 70-200 f4 would function just about as well as the 2.8 version when shooting in the studio at, let's say, 5.6 or f8. Of course, I was being cheap, and this lens is normally my second or third choice, as most of the time I'm going to use my RF 85mm 1.2 or 28-70 f2 in the studio. But today I'm going to put that miserly assumption to the test, and I'm going to discover whether or not I made a mistake back then, and if I need to buy myself, well, a new Christmas gift. So you may have noticed that everyone compares lenses on YouTube for the most part by taking two different lenses and shooting them wide open and then looking at the results. But that's seldom the way that I shoot in the studio because most of the time I stop the lenses down. And so I wanted to test out these two lenses today to see how they would perform at, let's say, 5.6 or f8. Last year I made a video comparing the 85mm choices for the R5, and that one ended up costing me about $2,000. So to say the least, I'm a little nervous that today's results will end up costing me even more money. Back then I thought that I could use the 85mm f2, but I discovered that the 1.2 version was the one that I needed. And when I tested out those 85mm lenses back then, I discovered that they were at their sharpest between 5.6 and f8. So my assumption is that these lenses will probably be at their sharpest in that area too. The reason for this is that stopping lenses down to the middle of their aperture range usually results in the sharpest image. So today we'll start off by checking the bokeh and the chromatic aberration. Then we'll check the sharpness at every f-stop on a close-up, and we'll see how they compare in two real-world portraits. So for our first test, let's evaluate the chromatic aberration, or CA, and the bokeh. My lovely model, Sia here, has agreed to sit patiently while I look at every major stop from 2.8 to f16 and a few f-stops in between at both 70mm and 135mm. Starting off at 70mm with the 2.8 lens at 2.8, you can see that the bokeh on the edge is a little oval, and you can see that the image is chromatic aberration free, even zoomed in here at 100%. Stopping down now at 3.2 and 3.5, the results are pretty much unchanged. As a total disclaimer, this is not a scientific test, just a practical one. TheDigitalPicture.com tested out the lenses and found chromatic aberration, so just take this test today as another data point, and I will link to their results in the description below. Now, as we compare the two lenses for the first time at f4 with the f4 lens on the left, the results are very similar. And as we stop down, the edge bokeh is getting rounder, and that's really all I have to report. Next, let's check the two lenses at 135mm. Well, it looks like more of the same. Oh, wait, here at f4, with the f4 lens, it has a little bit different bokeh. And by 5.6, it's smoother and, well, more of the same. Boy, that was exciting. And just to make sure that the color of the light in the background isn't having an effect on the chromatic aberration results, I shot this test with white lights in the background with both lenses at 70mm at f4, and as you can see zoomed in here to 100%, both images are chromatic aberration free. Overall, I'm very impressed by both of these lenses because they have 9 aperture blades. The blobs feel very round and pleasing, unlike the bokeh that you get from lenses that have only 6 blades and end up sort of producing this weird hexagonal shape. But let's now move on to conducting human trials. We'll start off with our lenses at 70mm pointed at our model Daniel. I noticed when I did those 85mm tests that the sharpness fell off significantly with one of the lenses around the subject's hairline. And I'm going to make sure today that when we're looking at the images at 100% that we can see the hairline, just to make sure that that isn't happening with these lenses. Normally, I make my living as a commercial beauty photographer and shooting haircuts, so the idea that the middle of the frame would be sharp but not the edges is a big deal for me. So looking at our first comparison here at f4, you can see that the 2.8 lens on the right is sharper. At 5.6, the two lenses are getting closer, but the facial hair is still sharper on the right. Things are looking pretty equal here at f8, and I threw in a second close-up of his facial hair for comparison's sake. The 2.8 is still a little sharper, and those hairs are just blacker overall. The same can be said here for f11 and f16. Now let's look at just the images from the f4 lens at 70 millimeters. From left to right, we have f4, 5.6, f8, f11, and f16. It feels like the lens is sharpest between 5.6 and f11. 5.6 or f8, though, might be the best frame. Here are the 6 images from the 2.8 lens at 70 millimeters, starting at 2.8 on the top left and going to f16 on the bottom right. The f-stops, as always, can be found below each frame. The 2.8 and the f16 images really are falling behind, but the others look good. So let's just look at the images now from f4 to f16. Once again, 5.6 to 11 looks pretty good, with f8 maybe taking the title. Now let's directly compare the two sets of images, the f4 lens images on the top and the 2.8 lens images on the bottom, all at 70 millimeters. Both lines are ordered left to right, f4, 5.6, f8, f11, and f16. When looking at the eyes at 100%, you can see that across the board, the 2.8 images are sharper, but it's not that big of a difference between 5.6 and f11. I really can't tell when comparing these eyelashes. Now looking at the mouth images and comparing the facial hair on the bottom row is just a little more defined overall, but it's not a huge difference. Now let's look at 135 millimeters. Looking at the two images side by side at f4, it looks like the 2.8 on the right may have more depth of field, or maybe it's just overall sharpness that's sort of masquerading as depth of field. To me, his left eyebrow all the way on the right seems to have more detail than the same eyebrow in the f4 image on our left. It really is hard to say. So we're doing some extreme pixel peeping here at 5.6, and it looks like the 2.8 lens has just a little more sharpness overall, including on this second 100% close-up of his hair. At f8, we're starting to see a stark difference in the sharpness between the lenses. Just look at the facial hair in the f4 lens image on the left and in this second close-up. And just so you know, I shot 5 frames with this lens at f8, and the one we just saw in the comparison is the best one from this series. It is the one in the middle, and you can see that it is the sharpest. And now, looking back again at the direct comparison, it's almost like the f4 lens on the left has less depth of field than the 2.8 lens on the right. Or at least it feels that way. And just to be clear, I used face and eye detection autofocus on the R5 with the camera on a tripod, and these results are only being lit with the flash. The ambient light isn't contributing to the exposure at all. I was really on the fence, but this particular part of the test may have just swayed me. At f11, the 2.8 lens on the right is still killing it, and the same goes for f16. Now let's look at the images from the f4 lens. From left to right, we have f4, 5.6, f8, f11, and f16. It feels like the lens might be at its sharpest between 5.6 and 11. Both 5.6 though and f11 seem to be sharper than f8, which is making me think this set of images at f8 was slightly back focused. But I know that doesn't really make sense, because usually the face and eye detection is spot on, and usually it wouldn't be off for 5 frames in a row. Here are the 6 images from the 2.8 lens, starting at 2.8 on the top left and going to f16 on the bottom right. The f-stops can be found below each frame. The 2.8 is holding its own, but it looks like 5.6 or f8 is best. Let's just look at the images from 4 to 16, and once again, 5.6 to f11 looks to be, the best images, and it's kind of hard to tell between them. Now, let's directly compare the two sets of images, the f4 images on the top and the 2.8 images, or the 2.8 lens images on the bottom. Both lines are ordered from left to right, f4, 5.6, f8, f11, and f16. When looking at the eyes at 100%, you can see that across the board, the 2.8 images on the bottom are sharper. Looking now at the mouth images and comparing the facial hair on the bottom row is just more defined overall, with maybe f8 resolving the most detail. But since that f8 result from the f4 lens here on the top center is suspect, let's just look at the shots taken at 5.6 and f11, and the difference between the two rows, top and bottom, it really isn't that significant. But before we move on to the real-world trials, I wanted to let you know about my exclusive members-only learning platform, the Academy with John Gress. On the Academy, you'll get access to exclusive members-only videos that are a lot longer than what you'll find here on YouTube. There's over 44 videos and 9+ hours of exclusive content. Plus, I'm adding a new video every month. Plus, you'll get access to 2 live Q&A and critique sessions every month. You'll be able to talk with me and other members over Zoom, and I'll answer questions and critique your images, and the floor is really open. Plus, you'll get access to my YouTube videos a little bit earlier, and you'll get discounts on my in-person workshops. So for more information and to sign up for a 3-day free trial, just go to johngress.com/academy. So I photographed Daniel with both lenses at 70mm in front of this window. I was exposing these images so that the outside would be properly exposed, and he was very dark indoors without the flash. These images were shot at 1/50th of a second at f4.5 at ISO 400. You can see that there is chromatic aberration along the edges of the window panes in both frames, but his hair appears to be sharper in the image on the right, which is from the 2.8 lens. The difference here is even more stark as we move in to 200%. In the second comparison, the ambient light was greatly overpowered. My exposure was at 1/200th at f8 at ISO 100. And I don't really care to calculate that, just know that it is far more than 3 stops over the ambient light. So I can say that without a doubt that any lack of sharpness that you see here is not due to motion blur, it's due to the properties of the lenses. As we zoom in here to 100%, you can see that there are more details on the right with the 2.8 lens, and the difference is just a little more clear as we zoom into 200%. But again, does this really matter? Should we even be judging lenses and deciding whether or not they look their best at 100% or 200% on a 50 megapixel photo? Is it even worth it to spend more money to get the 2.8 version if you're not going to shoot it at 2.8? I'm really sort of on the fence here, because when I looked at those headshots at 135, it seemed pretty clear to me that I would want to have the 2.8 lens. But then, looking at these other images, I'm really not sure. I could probably just use my RF 85 1.2 all of the time, unless I really needed a longer focal length or a shorter focal length, because sometimes I use it around 70mm. I'd love to compare the RF 70-200 f4 and the RF 85 1.2, and maybe I'll do that in a future video. Maybe there is some difference. I'm not really sure. I kind of expect that the prime will outperform the zoom. But speaking of zooms, I also have a 28-70 f2. Maybe that would be a better choice at 70mm than the 70-200 f4. I'm not really sure. So at the end of the day, I would love to know what you think. Do you think it's worth spending more money on the 2.8 lens? Should I sell the f4 and get the 2.8? Because after this test today, I can see there's a difference, but I'm just not really sure if it's worth it. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for your time. Stay safe. Have a great day. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. And I'll talk to you soon.